Hello everyone, welcome. I'll just wait for a few moments for everyone to arrive and then we can get started with today's session. Okay, I can see people starting to join. Let's have a lovely hour, get started. So hello and welcome to this webinar from the Cambridge Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, which is all about how baseline assessment reports can supplement your mock exam data. So before we get into the main session with Suzanne Tipping, I would just like to take you through some of the housekeeping. So to ensure good sound quality, all members of the audience are muted. If you would like to ask a question, and please do post questions throughout the session, you can use the question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll take a look at the questions at the end of the webinar, but please do submit any comments or questions as we go through. You will receive a certificate of attendance sent to your email inbox an hour after the webinar finishes, and you'll receive a copy of the webinar recording sent via email within the next week. So I'll just like to say a few words to introduce Cambridge Chem, which is the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. We've been working with schools for over 40 years in over 110 countries. We're known for our evidence-based research approach to baseline and formative assessments, using extensive data sets to support future outcomes and development. We analyse 600,000 assessments each year to ensure our data is globally trusted. We work with schools, ministries and associations to transform the outcomes of the students they teach. In 2019, we became part of the University of Cambridge, which has supported our reach and abilities to support young people across the world. So we help teachers turn data into knowledge, we bridge the gap between research and practice, and we provide evidence to support good decision making. So I'll now hand over to Suzanne Tipping, who is one of our assessment advisors, who will be taking you through today's session. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you, Cora, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. So today we're going to discuss how you can use baseline assessment to provide a measurement of current progress towards predictions. And I will talk about GCSEs, IGCSEs, A-levels and IB qualifications today. You might want to identify how students can be supported, where there are gaps between their mock exam results and predicted potential outcomes, and we'll chat a little bit about how you can use the baseline data to support you in doing that. And we'll also touch upon how you can start to predict your value-added residuals that you might expect at the end of the year. So we do have a number of baseline assessments at Chem, which range for students from 3 to 19 years. But today's webinar is going to focus on the secondary and post-16 baseline assessments. So we have MIGIS and YELIS for our pre-16 students, MIGIS, YELIS, and MIGIS for years 7, 8 and 9, YELIS for years 10 and 11, and ALIS for your post-16 students. I'll just start by telling you a little bit about each of those assessments. Some of you might be using them already, and that's why you're keen to know how you can use your baseline data alongside your mock exam data. But just in case you're not familiar with our Chem baseline assessments, I'll just explain a little bit about each one. So first of all, MIGIS is for students aged 11 to 14 years. It is a digital assessment and it takes around 50 minutes to complete. It's an adaptive assessment, so all students won't complete the exact same set of questions. The digital assessment will respond to the answers that the student gives, and it will present them with questions which are relevant to the student's ability level. So if they start to get their questions right, it will present them with slightly more challenging questions. If they don't get the questions right, then they will be presented with slightly easier questions, and we can continue that process through the algorithm so that we can really pinpoint the student's ability level. It's a baseline assessment, so it's going to tell you at the time that they do the assessment what their ability levels are. And in the MIGIS assessment, we have sections on vocabulary, maths, non-verbal, and skills. And our assessments will predict to GCSE and IGCSE, and I'll talk a little bit about the predictions reports for MIGIS during this webinar. YELIS is a very similar assessment, but it's for our students aged 14 to 16 years old. And it also takes around 50 minutes to complete. It's just a single digital assessment that can be completed on a laptop or a PC. Again, it's adaptive, and the questions that the student is asked will adapt to the students' ability levels and the responses that they give. And the YELIS assessment has very similar sections of vocabulary, maths, and it also assesses non-verbal ability. And YELIS will also predict to GCSE and IGCSE. Today I'll also refer to our ALICE assessment, which is for students aged 16 to 19 years. Again, on average, it takes about 50 minutes to complete. It's also an adaptive assessment, which is digital, and it has sections which will assess the students' ability levels in terms of vocabulary, maths, non-verbal and skills, just like MIDIUS. And our ALICE assessment will provide predictions for A-level and IBE diplomas. So our adaptive baseline assessments will hopefully help you in your schools to unlock the full potential of students, and it does that in a number of ways. So they're assessments that are can be carried out during key stages 3, 4 and 5, and they will help you get an idea of the students' strengths and weaknesses in terms of their ability levels, but also it will give you a very clear idea of how they're likely to perform in their GCSE and A-level exams. And it does this by providing nationally standardised scores for each of the assessments. You'll be able to compare performance to the national average for students of the same age. And you can look at standardisations for nationally for all schools. If you're from an independent school, you can also look at independent school averages as well. And our predictive data is generated from the baseline test scores. For ALICE, we also provide predictions which are generated based on average GCSE scores as well. So you have those two baselines, and that really informs you how each student is likely to perform at GCSE and A-level. And once students have completed their final exams, if you submit their results, then we will also, on the same day, generate value-added reports, which will really highlight your school's value-adding resources. You can see value added in terms of individual students and in particular subject areas. And you can use that to really get a good idea of where there might be opportunities to share good practice between subject areas and evaluate which interventions have really been successful in your school. So by combining your baseline assessment data, and we'll have a closer look at what that baseline assessment data looks like, and your mock exam data in terms of scores and results, it can really provide valuable insights into students' progress and also where there might be areas for improvement. So we're going to look during this webinar at how you can use those two sets of data alongside each other to really support improvement and support your students in achieving their goals. So we'll just start by having a look at some of the reports that are generated by our baseline assessments. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is just a screenshot of our interactive dashboard for MIDIUS and YELIS. The ALICE assessment reports look slightly different, but you still get very similar data from those. And the data that I'm going to refer to today, you will get for MIDIUS, YELIS and ALICE. So in terms of baseline scores, we have reports which will tell you what the standardised scores are overall for the baseline assessment, and also in the different sections of the report for each student. So you'll be able to see individually how each student has scored, but you'll be able to see that all in one place. You can look at that for a whole year group, you can look at it for a specific class, but we also have individual student reports which will tell you how the students have scored in the assessment, and it will tell you some other data as well, which I'll actually take a closer look at on a future slide. But it will give you a visual representation of the students' ability levels as well. So you can see at a glance what the students' strengths are, where they have high levels of ability, and where their ability levels are slightly lower and where they might benefit from support from you as well. We also have a report for parents and carers which outlines what the assessment's all about. It tells parents what the sections are of the report, and it also tells them what types of questions they might be asked. It gives some example questions, and it will give a very general overview of the student's ability level in each of the sections as well. We have a report which is the school band graph, which will tell you it will categorise students in terms of bands A, B, C or D, depending on their level of ability, and it will tell you for the whole cohort what percentage of your students fall into each category in terms of their ability levels. And you can also see that on the summary of year group scores as well. So we have some box and whisker plot graphs which will show you an overview of the student scores. If you use our assessments over time, you'll be able to compare the ability levels of students in one cohort compared to previous cohorts. So you'll be able to see in terms of their ability levels, if they fall into band A, B, C or D. You'll see what percentage of students fall into each category this year and how that compares to previous years. And again, I'll talk about how you can use that data during this webinar. So the other ones that I'll refer to during today's webinar are the predictions reports. So we have predictions, which will give a single prediction for students in different subject areas, but we also have chances graphs as well. So we'll take a closer look at those. Our predictions report will provide a detailed overview of the likely grade outcomes in a wide range of subjects for all students, and you'll see all of that on one table. And you'll be able to filter that down as well. You can you'll be able to see the subjects that you teach in your school and the qualifications that you teach as well. So depending on whether you deliver GCSE, IGCSE, A-level or IB qualifications, you'll be able to see the ones that are relevant to your school. But we also provide chances graphs, and we do that in a number of ways. So we have the chances graph report, which will show the likely distribution of grades for a specific year group in a selected subject. You'll be able to see for an individual student what their prediction is likely, what percentage chance they've got of getting each grade, because we know a prediction is not a certainty. So it's really useful to see what percentage chance a student has of achieving each grade in each subject area, and we present that data on one report as well. So for an individual student, you can look at all of the subjects that they're taking and you'll be able to see a chances graph for every single subject that they take all in one place. We also have chances graphs for subject areas, so that can be really useful for heads of department, so they can see what the likely grade distribution is going to be in their subject area for a particular year group. And you can also see individual student predictions and subject predictions in a table format as well. And once students have completed their final exams, when you upload the student results for GCSE, IGCSE, A-level or IB, we generate same-day value-added reports, and those value-added reports will show school value-added. So you'll be able to see a summary of the differences between predicted grades and awarded grades for all of your subjects on one chart. And we also show that in a table format, and we have a chart which will show all of the individual students' value-added residuals on a scatter plot graph. And if you use Chem baseline assessments over time, you'll be able to see what your school performance looks like in terms of value-added over time as well. So just a few things that I might refer to during this webinar. We do generate standardised scores, and for our standardised scores, we use a mean of 100. So the scores are standardised so that an average score would be 100, and then all of the scores that the students achieve will fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean, and those standard deviations of 15. And the standardised scores are provided as an overall score for the assessment as a whole, but we also generate standardised scores for each individual section of the assessment that the students are taking. So you can pinpoint their ability levels in terms of vocabulary, maths, non-verbal abilities, and their skills as well. And I did already reference the bands A to D. So the scores are then placed into bands A to D. So the top 25% will fall into band A, the next 25% band B, and so on. But we also report what percentile the students fall into, and we report stay nines as well. And that just gives you that slightly more granular data, so you can really you could drill into it that little bit more rather than just having the standard 4 bands. So the percentiles will indicate the percentage of the population that a student has scored better than in that particular section of the assessment. And the stay nines are just another way of dividing that normal distribution. So rather than just having them into 4 bands of 25% each, we put them into 9 groups. So most students, when they're compared to students of a similar age, would fall into the middle bands, stay 9s 4, 5 and 6. But your high achievers with a higher level of ability will be in stay 9s 7, 8 and 9, 9 being the highest, and your lower achievers in stay 9s 1, 2 and 3. So now that I've given you a little bit of background about our assessments and the reports that those assessments generate and some of the language around it, we'll talk a little bit more about the data that's generated. We'll look at some of the report data and we'll talk about how you can use that alongside mock exam data and what you can actually do with that, what your next steps might be. So initially, you could use the baseline assessment data to support you in target setting. So baseline assessment data can really help you set those initial targets for students at the start of the year. But of course, this gives the students something to aim towards. It gives the teaching staff really useful data in terms of expectations of students. But then that mock exam data is going to give you a clearer view of what you might expect from students. It may well identify students that are underachieving or students that perhaps you could be challenging with more aspirational targets. So it may well be that those targets can be adjusted and refined with the use of mock exam data. And a student who had initially quite a low prediction in a particular subject area based on their ability level alone, you might see actually they've got a real flair in that subject. They're really dedicated. They're put in some hard work, and that they're going to be capable of achieving a lot more in your particular subject area. And it may well be that the targets can be adjusted. So at KEM, we make predictions by applying statistical techniques to the data that we have on exam performances and baseline measures of students. So schools and other education institutions will provide us with the exam results of their students, and we match those results to earlier baseline measures for student ability. So I mentioned already that we gather data on students' results for our value added reports. That's one way that we collect the data. And so for each exam subject, a baseline combination, we then have a data set where we know each student's baseline measure and their later exam outcome. So our stats team then apply ordinary least squares linear regression to the matched data set. And what that allows them to do is predict what the likely outcome is going to be for a student in a particular subject area, because we look at the correlation between baseline data and how the students have performed later on, and we'll only predict if there's a strong enough correlation there. And we've got such a good quality data set now that we can do that really accurately. So in addition to just giving a single prediction for each subject area, what we also have is a chances graph report. And the chances graphs show the probability of a student achieving the whole range of possible final GCSE, IGCSE, A-level or IB grades. So depending on the information that you provide for us when you register for our baseline assessments, it will provide a chances graph which will be relevant to the qualifications that you teach. So if you say that you teach GCSE 9 to 1 history, then that's a chances graph that you'll see. But if it's A to G, GCSE or IGCSE, then you'll see a chances graph for that. So the point prediction provides a really useful starting point when thinking about target setting for a student. But the chances graph provides a much more realistic way to think about a student's likely exam outcome compared to the single predicted grade from the point prediction. So you can use chances graphs in discussions with students to encourage and motivate, as well as help guard them from complacency. And another important point is to use the predictions together with your own knowledge of the students, and that might include your mock exam data. So in some cases, you might feel that the predictions and chances are too optimistic or pessimistic based on the information that you have about the students. And mock exam data is a key piece of data that you can use in this scenario. So by construction, the predictions and chances assume that a student with a given score is average for a student with that score, and effectively a random student drawn from a group of students of that score. But you've got knowledge of a student's particularly strong ability in a given student, or where a student has particular challenges. It may be that there are other things going on with the student at the moment that's preventing them from attending full time, for example. There might be something that's impacting their concentration levels. And so, it's important to take that into consideration as well. So I'm going to continue to talk about chances graphs alongside the mock exam data a little bit later on when we look at the all chances as well. But it is really quite useful. And I'm going to talk now about a number of ways that you can use the chances graphs with your students. So I already mentioned, warning more able students against complacency. If they've got a predicted grade, which is a high predicted grade, they know they're quite an able student, perhaps they find the subject quite easy. It can be the case that some students might get quite complacent and are not putting the work in that needs to go in alongside relying on their ability level alone. So it's quite it's a key piece of data that you can share with students as part of a discussion. If you feel like a student is becoming a little bit complacent in their day-to-day school life in a particular subject area, you can show them the chances graph and say, well, yes, you do have a high level of ability. You have been predicted a grade 8 or a grade 9, for example. But actually, if you look at this information here, it tells us that students of the very much the same ability level of you have gone on to only achieve a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or whatever it might be. You can say that you really want that grade 7, but actually 17% of students with the same ability level of you didn't go on to achieve that, and perhaps they're the ones that did become a little bit complacent. So it's really useful to use as a motivational tool. And it can encourage less able students to work hard and stay focused. Perhaps they've been given a predicted grade which they're not happy with. They'd like to think that they'd be able to achieve more. Perhaps they need to achieve more to get to the next stage in their education, to actually get onto that college course that they wanted to, or study a particular subject at A level, or to get onto a particular course at university, at a chosen university. So encouraging them that with this information and saying, okay, you've been predicted a 4, but actually look at this chart here. We can see that students of a similar ability level of you, some of them went on to achieve a grade 5 or a grade B at A level or a grade A. And you can really use that information to motivate those less able students, to show them that they can do it. It is possible for them to get a higher grade than they're expecting to. And that said, it shows that a predicted grade or level is not a foregone conclusion just because they've got this target grade on a piece of paper. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's a goal. It's something to work towards, but it's not a given. And there is the possibility. It has happened in the past where other students have not gone on to achieve that grade. It's been the case that some students have exceeded their target grades. Anything's possible. So it's a really useful piece of information to support those conversations. And it can also help during parent conversations as well, and help parents understand the realistic likely achievements of their child and manage expectations either way. And it just illustrates different chances of success in different subjects. So, it may well be that a student has quite standard predictions across the board, but in some cases, there might be certain subject areas where they're likely to do better and they've got a better chance of achieving a higher grade. And some schools use this to aid option choices for students as well when they're deciding which GCSE subjects or which A-level subjects they'll go on to study. So you can also use your baseline data alongside your mock exam data to identify certain trends. So, by comparing baseline data results in terms of the students' ability levels, and you might use our standardized scores report for that. You can see that on the screen now. You can see that each row represents a different student, and you will receive a report which tells you their overall score and which band they fall into, but also their individual scores for vocabulary, maths, non-verbal ability and skills. And sometimes their ability levels vary. It may appear that they've got quite an average level of ability, but that may be represented by a high level of ability in terms of vocabulary and a low level of ability in terms of maths, or a different combination of scores. So, by comparing your baseline data with your mock exam data, you might be able to identify some trends in terms of what's causing them to get certain grades. So, it might well be that there are certain areas where students consistently struggle. There could well be some areas that they could very clearly improve on, where there has been improvements, or there might have been some level of decline. And that, of course, could be related to subject topics, but it could be linked to their ability levels in certain areas as well. So this might be something that an individual subject teacher could do for their class. So when marking the mock exams and providing feedback, they might identify trends. So it could be incorrect definitions of subject key terms. There might be certain misconceptions around certain topics related to vocabulary, misunderstanding what the question's asking them. I've seen that quite often, and then there are certain students that I used to see would, in my time in teaching, that might have struggled with just understanding the vocabulary in the question. They might be misusing vocabulary, which is causing their answers to have a different meaning in their longer written responses and essays. Perhaps they've struggled with questions that have a maths element, whether they've had to do a calculation or interpret data in some way. Can you see that they've struggled with the visual aspects of the paper? So, for example, understanding diagrams, or have they not managed their time well, or struggled with the time pressure element and not completed the paper? Could they have used a better structure for their answers, or improved their spelling, punctuation and grammar? Did they fail to proofread effectively? That's something that we assess as part of our skills section. So our baseline assessments are measuring each student's ability levels in these key areas. And when cross-referencing their standardized scores in each area, a teacher might be able to identify the specific areas where, if you look at the standardized scores in the different areas and then cross-reference their standardized scores in each area with what you have seen in their mock exams. So when you've looked at their mock exams, you might well see that, as I've mentioned before, they have struggled with vocabulary elements, they have struggled with maths elements. Does that link in with what the standardized scores are telling you about that student? So I'll talk more about this again later when we look at the individual student profile report, because that takes an even closer look at each individual student and gives you some ideas on how you might support them in the lead up to their real exams. It can support curriculum planning. So of course, after marking mock exams, it does become quite clear to the subject teacher which topics relate to their subject that they might need to revisit, or might need to be interleaved into future lessons or covered in a revision class. But you can be proactive, not just with classes, but also with whole year groups in terms of additional support that you might offer students from the start. So we have a cohort profile which will show you what percentage of students fall into each band overall and in each section. So we have some really clever filters on the interactive reports which will allow you to choose just vocabulary, or just maths, just non-verbal skills, just look at the students' ability levels in terms of proofreading or perceptual speed and accuracy. And you'll be able to see student ability levels across the year group in each of these sections. So for example, if you filter by vocabulary or maths and you find a large proportion of this year group fall into band D, which is the lowest, the bottom 25% of all students, If you find that that's the case this year, it might be appropriate to put some additional resources into improving literacy or math skills across the year group. So could that be funding some extra tuition? Could it be delivering some staff CPD on how to improve vocabulary in class and in your subject area? Could it be sharing teaching and learning ideas for improving subject-specific vocabulary or modelling maths techniques? Using key term glossaries and formula cheat sheets for examples and lessons. It could be as simple as dedicating in-class assessment time to proofreading and encouraging students to incorporate this into their assessment time. Practicing proofreading as part of a peer assessment task of other students' classwork. So they really develop that skill so that they're checking their work and identifying their own mistakes and putting them right before their exam paper submitted. So it can help you with planning your curriculum, yes, for individual classes, but also across the year group and thinking about what kind of intervention can you put in place across the year group, which is specific to the ability levels within this year's cohort. And that might look different. Some schools like to go for a whole school approach, which can be really effective. But it might well be that you adapt your strategies for individual year groups based on the data that you get from the baseline assessments. So yeah, you can look at a whole cohort and you can look at your students' ability levels across the year group. But the baseline data can also help you to develop personalised learning plans for individuals as well. So this links in with what we discussed on the identifying trends slide. It's super useful for teachers to have this data about their students at the start of the year. So when they start to teach their students, if they've got this data, it can be a really good starting point for deciding how they or you, if you're the classroom teacher, how you might tailor teaching or differentiate tasks and resources within the classroom. So it's not just about providing support with the vocabulary, the maths and the non-verbal elements of your course, but it's also about understanding which students might be capable of the more challenging activities as well, and really like pushing them on so that hopefully when they come to do their subject specific assessments and eventually their mock exams, they're starting to exceed their targets because they've really been challenged. You can offer them perhaps more complex texts to read, case studies and articles which have that additional information in it, just another layer of kind of theory or subject specific content that they can include in their answers. You can, which students can take the calculations or the data related problems to the next level because they've got a really high level of ability in this area. So it might be really useful to identify in your mark book whether students are in band A, B, C or D in this area, and that can help you decide which tasks and resources or what level of questioning you're going to give to the students to really meet their learning needs. So this report can be used after mock exams to support analysing mock data and working out why a student might have got a certain result. Is it because they've got quite a low score for vocabulary and that's hindered their chances of actually achieving their predicted grade? Did they really struggle with the maths element? So, I was a former business and economics teacher. Vocabulary and maths, their ability levels in these areas would have had a really significant impact on their ability to achieve a certain grade, I think, because with both business and economics, a lot of the questions relied upon the students reading extended pieces of writing, case studies about businesses, being able to read between the lines and interpret what the data was saying about the business. It might have been maybe they had to look at economic data and do some additional calculations like percentage change or interpret a graph and then talk about what that means using subject specific vocabulary. So that would have a big impact on their grade and how they performed in their mock exams and their final exams. So you can look at it afterwards, cross-reference the data and try and identify perhaps, what's had an impact on their grade. But of course, it's even more useful to be proactive and have that data at the start of the year, and from the start support students in reaching their full potential through giving them every chance to achieve and exceed their target grades where possible, through giving the support and the challenge that they need in those particular areas. So coming back to the chances graphs again, you might use the chances graphs as part of your feedback and reflection time that you have on your mock exams. So discussing both baseline assessment and mock exam data with students can really provide valuable feedback and promote self-reflection. After the mock exams, if you're blessed with the time to do this in your class, you might want to have a one-to-one with your students. You might do that already to reflect on their performance in their mock exams. So this was something that I always did with GCSE and A-level students. After they'd done their mock exams and we had their results, while students in the class were responding to feedback and doing some green pen corrections and improvements to their exam answers independently, I'd have a quick chat with each student about their results in my particular subject area. Now, this might be done with the classroom teacher, but it may well be that you have your senior leadership team or a tutor or a mentor team that could also do this feedback and reflection with students, and they could use the all chances graph as part of that. So if you can use that as part of the conversation to show the students what their chances are of achieving their target grades, it's a really useful visual to show that, you know, sometimes students perform below their ability level, and talk about some of the reasons why. So, and these could be some of the reasons that are specific to the student that you've got sitting in front of you. So, you know, did they not adequately prepare for the exams? You know, did they not do any revision, or did they not have a suitable revision timetable? Did they do too much revision and it was just a bit overwhelming and they were exhausted? They didn't put the time in to actually rest and recuperate and do things that they enjoy. Could it have been down to poor attendance, not completing homework tasks or applying themselves fully in class? Could it have been something outside of their control? You can talk about that as part of your discussions. And it can be really motivational to show them that they're capable of exceeding their predictions, and that there will be some students who have in fact attained grades perhaps 4 grades above what you would expect from someone of their ability level. The prediction is just that, it's forecasting what the likely outcome will be. But it certainly shouldn't be a limiter of aspiration in any way. And, you know, that's something that you can make clear to students, that, you know, a prediction, or, and if that's used to influence what their target grades are, it's certainly not a maximum for them. It's not a cap. And, you know, for that reason, some schools would actually call it a target minimum grade or something similar, to show, you know, this is kind of the least you should be aiming for, if not more. So we also have a chances graph by subject report as well. So these reports display the likelihood of the whole range of grades that might be achieved in each subject in the school. And this is a useful one to share with heads of department or teachers of a particular subject, so they can see what is the likely grade distribution in their subject area with the students who are in their current cohort, based on the ability levels of those students and what they're likely to achieve. And heads of department might want to look at the expected distribution of grades, so they can see what they're likely to expect in terms of results. And they can compare that to the mock exam data to see where students are currently at and see how close they are to the expected outcomes. And this will really help to identify those students who might need that additional intervention and support to get them where they need to be. So the subject chances graphs show either the GCSE or IGCSE, A-level or IB grade distribution a subject could achieve if all students achieve the grade that they've been predicted. And this is based on their main prediction in a particular subject. So this feedback will provide an indication of how your students and your school are expected to perform against various external performance indicators. And we do provide the opportunity for teachers to adjust the predictions based on other information that you've got about your school or your particular subject area. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a moment and how you might use that adjustment tool. We have a parent and carers report. So this is a really handy report that can be used to just explain to parents what the MIGIS, YELIS or ALICE baseline assessment is. It explains why the students have actually done this assessment, and it tells parents a little bit more about the different sections of the assessment that they're sitting. I don't expect you to be able to read anything that's on that report. It just gives you kind of a very basic look at what the parents will see. It will also provide an example question so they can see what the questions are likely to look like that the students will be sitting. In addition to that, it will give them a very general overview of the students' ability levels in the different areas of the assessment. But it just tells them, whether their ability level is average compared to other students of their age nationally, whether it's below average or above average. It doesn't give any specific scores. And it does provide a little bit of general guidance about where the students might need some additional support. So if you've got a really engaged parent who wants to do everything that they can to support their children, their young people at home, then you can provide them with this data, and they can, if you share this data alongside mock exam data, they not only have a little bit of information about where the students are performing academically, but it also gives them a little bit of guidance of areas where they might be able to support that little bit more at home. So if they've got a low ability in terms of vocabulary, could they be doing some key term tests and getting, testing their children on what the definitions are for different key terms, or checking their understanding of exam questions on past papers to make sure they've really got a grip of that. Could they be doing some extra maths tutorial, or just some kind of extra maths activities, or downloading some maths apps at home, that kind of thing? Could they be, when they're doing their homework, encouraging them to proofread their homework, or doing it under timed conditions, or doing those past papers to practice under timed conditions, things like that. So it's a little bit of extra information that you can provide to parents. So in terms of monitoring progress, you can track students' progress using mock exam grades and comparing those to the baseline assessment predictions that are provided by MIGIS, YELIS and ALICE. And if you do that, that allows you as teachers and school leaders to really measure the effectiveness of teaching and learning and any interventions that you've already put in place. And helps to evaluate the overall progress of a particular class, a particular subject area, or the whole cohort. So what you see on the screen on the right hand side are from two different reports. So we provide prediction reports by subject, and also for an individual student for all subjects as well. So for example, if you had the predictions for art and design, A to G, for example, if it was an IGCSE, you might be looking at those qualification grades. You would have a row for each student, and you would have their standardized score, what band they fall into, what their predicted grade is. And as you can see at the top, there's an adjustment tool as well. So what you can do, you can adjust predictions based on any kind of like previous information you have about performance in a particular subject area. So our interactive reports have a really handy adjustment tool, and some schools use it to create aspirational target grades. So they might want to put all target grades up by a certain percentage. They might want to adjust it to make predictions in line with previous levels of performance. So for example, if you've got a subject area that usually performs particularly well, they might generally have a +1 value added residual in a particular subject area. You can adjust it by +1. You can adjust it by half a grade, you can adjust it by any point there. But you can also adjust target grades or predictions for that for future course or UCAS applications based on mock results. So if a student is predicted a B in their A-level art and design, for example, and actually you know that when they've completed their mock exam, they achieved an A, then you might want to adjust that up by a grade so that you've got a record of that, because you know that this student's got a particular flair in this subject, a talent, for example, or they've worked really hard to exceed expectations. And the one underneath that you can see, that's by subject. So you can see that sorry, it's not by subject, it's by individual student. So for every individual student, it'll have a list of the subjects and the qualifications that they're taking, and it will have a predicted grade for them. And again, you can adjust those depending on where students, you know from other information, they're likely to do better, or if there are reasons why they might not necessarily do as well as expected. There might be some very clear reasons which are fine for why they might not perform as expected. So I said we talk a little bit about predicting value added today as well. So first of all, if I just give you an example of what one of our actual value added charts looks like. So when you on results day, you can upload student results via a CSV file to your Chem account, and same day we will provide value added reports, and we provide value added reports which show value added residuals by subject, by individual student, and we also have value added reports which show what your value added residuals look like over time if you've used Chem baseline assessments for more than a year. So just looking at this one, for example, the bars on this chart are the residuals, and they show the difference between a predicted grade that we have provided and the achieved exam grade. On this particular value added report, it's using the average for the whole class. So, this is very useful when looking at it after your summative exams, and for using as part of whole school evaluations, subject area evaluations. But you can also track your predicted value added residuals by calculating the difference between predicted grades and your mock exam grades. So you've got an idea ahead of receiving this report in terms of what that might look like. And this is something that currently you can't do within our system currently, but it's something that can be quite easily done by downloading our predictions report as a CSV file. So you can download any of our reports which are on the interactive dashboard. For Alice, we have Excel and PDF versions of our reports. So if you download those CSV files, you can add columns for your mock exam results to be added to, add a formula which will calculate value added, a very simple formula, which you or someone in your school might have the skill set to do, and it will then show you what your value added is likely to be. So you can track your mock exam data against predictions from our baseline assessments to see what value added is likely to be, if that's something that you use as an evaluation tool. Now, today's webinar, the focus was on using baseline assessment data alongside mock exam data, and how you can use those two together to help improve student progress, help them achieve their predicted final outcomes, identify which students might need certain support in certain areas or challenge. But we have other assessment tools that we offer as well, which are also quite useful to look at in combination with your mock exam data as well. One that really does help to give a really holistic view of your student in terms of how they're doing academically, but also what their well-being is like and how they are feeling and how they are functioning, is the Cambridge Wellbeing Check. So the Cambridge Wellbeing Check is it's a digital survey that will measure how your students are feeling and functioning in terms of their life satisfaction, to what extent they're experiencing negative emotions, what their interpersonal and their competence well-being looks like. and how they're feeling in those areas and how they're functioning in those areas. You can just see a snippet of a report here that just shows one section and just shows some examples of the type of questions that they might be asked. But it's a digital check. It takes about 20 minutes to complete. It's a check that you can do as frequently as you like throughout the academic year. And it's a tool that some schools like to use around more stressful times of the year to really check the well-being of their students and really measure well-being and see how they're feeling and if that's been impacted by particularly stressful times of the year. And that might be around the mock exam period or while students are studying for their summative exams as well. So by comparing your mock exam data with data from the Cambridge Wellbeing Check, then you might be able to see that there's a correlation between how a student's feeling and their level of well-being and how they've performed academically. So, it may well be that it's not all of the academic support that we've talked about that they'll benefit from, but more so that emotional support and strategies that can be put in place to support their well-being. And you can use the reports to really drill down to find out what area of their well-being they might be struggling with a little bit. Whether it's their confidence, whether it's knowing that they're doing well, whether it's related to their relationships and just feeling a little bit lonely or not feeling valued, whether actually there's a lot of pressure for them to do really well in these mock exams. This mock exam is going to influence perhaps a predicted grade that goes on their UCAS application or a UCAS reference, for example. And, is that causing a high level of anxiety, which is then having an impact on their performance in the exam? It may well be that something happening outside of school, which is making them feel particularly sad or worried, and which is affecting the concentration levels in class and during the exam. So, it's just something else that you can look at. It's another piece of the puzzle, which is really going to just provide that holistic view of the student, and looking at, how the students are doing and how they're performing. So I hope that has created some insight. I hope it's been useful in terms of considering how you might use baseline data or tools like the Cambridge Wellbeing Check alongside mock exam data, whether that be looking at it in hindsight after the exams have taken place and when you're analysing the data and looking at, where have students done well, where have students not done as expected, and what support can we put in place now, or whether it's actually not waiting until that mock exam period, which I know, in schools, you absolutely will be looking at what you can do from the start, looking at what the students' ability levels are, what the strengths are, what the weaknesses are, where you can offer support, where you can offer challenge, and doing that from the start to make sure that they've got every chance of the success that they deserve. So thank you for listening. I'll hand over to Cora to let me know whether there have been any questions in the chat box. But, afterwards, if there's anything that you want to ask, you can also email me, suzanne.tipping@cambridge.org, and I'll try and answer your questions via email as well. And also, if you want any additional information about any of our baseline assessments or the wellbeing check, for example, we can set up some time to chat about that further as well. So thank you for listening today. And Cora, I'll hand over for any questions.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Suzanne. That's a really interesting session. We've got lots of comments here saying thank you for the session, some really interesting things to think about. So we've got a fair few questions coming through. We will try and answer as many as we can, but as we said, any that we don't manage to get around to, I'm sure we will follow up with afterwards. Let me just get up. Okay, so we've got a question here which is asking, how much does a weak verbal score affect the overall predicted grades if everything else is high? They're saying that in their school they've observed some students with very high scores and very high predicted outcomes, but their language means they're not, or their language level means they're not quite reaching their potential. How can they use baseline assessments to perhaps identify these students?
Yeah, so in particular, if you look at the individual student profile, this is the one that's going to give you the the data in terms of the different sections of the report, which is going to help you identify the individual sections or the individual areas where they might need that individual support. So you're absolutely right. If a student, it's quite possible that they could have an average level of ability, which is then going to predict them a particular score in a particular subject area, but that has been influenced by their kind of overall vocabulary and math score combined, because it's the adaptive sections of the assessment, the vocabulary and the math section, because these are the strongest predictors of academic outcomes. There's the closest, that gives us the closest correlation between their ability levels and the scores that they're then going to achieve. You're absolutely right. So if they've got kind of an average overall score, but that's because they've got a high level of ability in terms of maths and a low level of ability in terms of vocabulary. The great thing about our baseline assessment is that you get that individual report and you are provided with that information. You don't just get an overall score, which then goes on to give them an average prediction. You can see that, okay, they've got this prediction, but actually all things considered, and that might take into consideration a low vocabulary score. This is what they're likely to go on to achieve. Now, if you've got that data that tells you that they've got a low level of ability in terms of vocabulary, you know that that's where you need to focus the support for that individual student. It's likely that the data, it's a really good question, because the data that we've got is based on a combination of the vocab score and the math score. And that's something that you need to be aware of, that you've got to look at the individual students and look at where their strengths and their weaknesses lie, and whether that's impacted by a particularly high grade or a low grade in a particular subject. But if you've got that data, you know which students would really benefit from that additional support in terms of vocabulary. And we see it quite a lot that sometimes students with English as an additional language might come out with a particularly low vocabulary score, and it may well be that with the natural development that they have in terms of their language and the additional intervention that they might get as a student with English as an additional language, naturally it's going to increase their chances of achieving their predicted grade. But I think it is important to look at the individual profiles, see where they need support, because it's likely that they will need support in terms of vocabulary, and they will need support in terms of maths if that's the area of low ability. It might depend on the subject area and to what extent vocabulary and maths is really important and a large part of that subject area as well. So I mentioned before, being a business and economics teacher, there was an element of maths in there. The students did have to do calculations, and so that was likely to impact their overall score. So yes, it is based on averages, but having that extra information about the students' ability levels is really going to help you pinpoint which students need what intervention and support. So I hope that answers your question, but if not, we can delve a little bit deeper into that, and I can speak to our stats team with perhaps an even more insight into to what extent it has, because it may well be that we've actually done some research on that previously, and if we have, I can pass that on.
Brill, thank you, Suzanne. So we've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just run through probably a couple more questions really briefly, but like I say, we can continue any of these conversations after the session. So there's a few people asking about how to access the tests or the assessments. Is there an opportunity to trial the assessments or to look at how they might be applicable to their school, to put together a proposal for their SLT? I don't know if you had any suggestions there or any thoughts on trying out the assessment.
Absolutely. So depending on which assessment it is, it might be useful actually if you identify that you would like some further information on MIDIUS, YELLIS or ALICE or all three, if you let us know via the chat box, if you pop that question in, Cora will be able to see that. And if you're happy to, I can contact you via email to set up a one-to-one chat where I can actually demonstrate the assessment. I'll be able to show you what the assessment looks like, what the administration side of it looks like. We can take a closer look at the reports. You can ask any questions specific to your school, so to find out whether it'll meet your needs, your assessment needs in your school, and whether it'll be accessible for your students. But we can offer a limited number of trial assessments as well, if you want to try it out with a number of students, or you want to have a go at the assessment just to see what it looks like, what it feels like, and what the experience would actually be for a student. So absolutely, either get in touch with me directly on the email that's on the screen, or let Cora know in the chat box if you'd like us to get in touch with you. And also, if you're interested, if you think, actually, I know quite a bit about it already, it's something I'd like to try, you can go to chem.org. And on the page for each individual assessment, there's a Buy Now button, and you just need to complete a registration form. Our customer service team will get in touch within 48 hours, and they will provide you with login details and next step instructions. And if you're interested in finding out more about costs, for example, we also have a really handy pricing calculator on the website as well. So if that's something that's obviously important as part of the decision-making process about using a baseline assessment, we're quite open about you being able to find out for yourself how much that might cost for your school as well.
Brill, thanks so much, Suzanne. So I think that's all we have time for today. As I've said, we'll follow up with any outstanding questions, or do feel free to get in touch with Suzanne with her email address on screen there. So just to say thank you, Suzanne, for a really interesting presentation and for your time today. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found it an interesting session. We'll be sending around the slides and a copy of the recording within the next few days, so please do keep an eye out in your inbox for those. So I'll end the session now, but thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.